First thing is, many of the talks we've heard today are very much scientific and data-driven, and I'm a lot more low-key than that. I'm just a veterinarian in general practice. I'm a Boston Terrier owner, and you can't see it too well, but these are my dogs. When one wears a collar, we all wear collars for obvious reasons. And but my story today is more of a political and anecdotal story. I'm not going to give you data. I don't have data. I have personal observation and the work that I've done with my colleagues in the Connecticut Veterinary Medical Association on this issue of interstate, what I call interstate trafficking in dogs. And you may not like that term if you're of that mindset, but it very much looks like that from an outside observer's point of view. And someone asked a question while I was sitting in the back during the last lecture about breed rescue versus general rescue. And I'll just say that, I just want you to know I have nothing against rescue. I love individual dogs. I have individual dogs, and I understand all that. And I look at a lot of this this activity that's going on. You've got national organizations and local focusing very hard on neutering all sorts of animals in every direction, and then we've got animals being transported, and we've got shelters, and they're moving them all around. And I look at all that and I say, well, why aren't we dealing with the problem at its source? And that's kind of an underlying theme of what got me upset and got me involved in this thing in the first place. So I just wanted to say that. And then someone else, one of the speakers, used the word transfer. Transfer. Now, transfer is much more encompassing and broad than adoption, than sale. It kind of implies that when an animal is given to someone else for any reason, whether money changes hands or not, that certainly could fall under the word transfer. And in Connecticut, as you'll see, we got the word transfer put into law. Now, you may not like law. I mean, I'm not a fan of big government either, as some of you who had a conversation with me last night may know. But we had a problem in Connecticut. We're the destination, we're the dumping ground for a lot of what people are talking about with all this, some humane relocation, remain translocation, I've heard. There's a lot of that. But I don't see it that way, because I'm in a state where we have the consequences of what everybody else is doing, thinking that, well, a life saved is a life saved. And you'll hear that expression twice more during this presentation. So I just wanted to comment on that. And let's see, what's that other thing say? Right, so we'll begin. So you might ask, well, why would a veterinarian not want sick animals to do work on and make a living? It's counterintuitive, right? Bring them on. The more heartworm, babesiosis, whatever you bring to me, the more money I can make from my clients. Well, I don't see that way either. I mean, here's the veterinarian's oath, and you'll note that in the very first sentence, before it says anything about animals at all, we're supposed to be doing work for the benefit of society. And there was a famous veterinarian, an epidemiologist named Calvin Schwabe, who wrote a book that's very hard to come by now, a paperback called What Should a Veterinarian Do? And I took that book to heart, and throughout that book it talks about doing right for society, that our work and what we do for animals is not an isolated project of animal welfare, but it is an integral part of society. And you see that theme taken up now in the One Health concept. You may see, if you follow veterinary issues, that environmental health, animal health, and human health are all related, and that's how many veterinarians should be thinking about it. But 80% or more of veterinarians are in small animal practice. They're just like the general population. They come out of cities and suburbs, and they go into veterinary school where they're impacted by all sorts of influences whose names I won't speak because this is polite company. And then they come out into society, and they're just like regular people, And oh, we lost our slide, didn't we? So I've got to keep that going. Right. I don't know about that sleep business, but anyway, so I just want you to know that's kind of how I come at it. My first obligation is to my clients and their animals then together, not one or the other. And I have some spirited discussions with my colleagues about that. So having said that, there is an impact on veterinary practice of all this importation or transfer, importation of animals across state lines, great distances, into my state. And there isn't a lot of data on it, as has been said by others. There's been a couple of publications, notably by Julie Levy from UF, on the disease incidence. And you know, we bandy about heartworm and some other infectious type diseases. The animals arriving are not only arriving with infectious diseases that affect other house-made animals or other animals elsewhere, but they're arriving with illnesses of their own, individual illnesses that cost money of my clients to take care of. And I got to start seeing that in practice. You know, a year, 2, 3 years since Katrina, when Pet Finder got big and this, you know, the rescue transport went from what must have been a trickle before, I have no way of knowing, to what is now a massive industry. Somebody mentioned the numbers. That was another comment. The magnitude. Nobody knows the magnitude. Well, you know who knows the magnitude? To some degree, are the driving companies. They have a known number of trucks with a known number of cages, and they make a known number of trips to stops. And if you talk to Kyle Peterson and other companies of that type, and they gave honest answers, I'll bet you we'd have a handle on maybe 2/3 of the total north, south to north movement. Now, I know that, and what got me here was, you know, Patty Strand has been integral in creating information regarding international importation, something I really knew nothing about. I knew about this business from Puerto Rico, but I didn't know much about international. So that's a whole new scope that went beyond really what I was focused on, which was our little state of Connecticut and what's been happening there from south to north. And I don't want to offend anybody from the south. I was skeptical too, that it was one way, but the people doing the transport, they freely admit it, and I'm going to show that to you. So there are some publications about disease impact, and we veterinarians, we care about animal health, and so that matters. This is Amber. Amber came to me, you know, one Saturday, a second opinion from another veterinarian, and this dog didn't come off. It's under general anesthesia, mind you. It's a live pet. You can see the tongue color is still pink. If it bleeds, it's got to be alive, you know. So, and this is kind of sad. I mean, this dog didn't come off the trailer looking quite like this, but it came off with skin lesions. It went to a colleague. Perhaps for whatever reason, the colleague undertreated it, and the dog kept getting worse. And this dog has demodectic mange. It's really generalized. You know, you may know there's two forms, the localized and generalized form. And more often than not, when the generalized form starts at a young age, you know, it's a lifetime thing. And years ago, pre-ivermectin, those dogs often got euthanized. Now, you know, sometimes not. But this is how the dog looked after being shaved. And this was a client who had the means. And so we went at treatment over quite a period of time. And the dog got a lot better even than this, where you couldn't see any lesions. If you look closely here, you'll see hair loss and redness. Now, mind you, that last case, that wasn't just demodectic mange, that was secondary bacterial infection from bacteria that are normally present on the surface of the skin. So that's what happens with untreated disease or inadequately treated disease of the skin. It typically gets infected because the bacteria are there already. In any case, the dog got a lot better, almost normal, and then maybe 2-3 months off medication, we had this again. And this has happened a few times. And, you know, this was a very nice lady who I'd only known a short time. And, of course, I've had other cases. And oh, maybe I missed the point. It was a rescue dog. Did I not say that? And it came off the van with a lesion. And the lesion was not visible on the petfinder.com image. In fact, the lady's convinced it was a different picture on there. And I've heard that a few times before, too. Kind of like you have a stock photo. You know, you got a NASCAR race, they'll just pull some photo out of the files and throw it up there. Well, I think that's going on more often than not. I personally have heard it twice. Others I know have heard it, too. And so, you know, I've been involved in organized veterinary medicine, and if you don't know what that means, that's organizations. You know, the American VMA, the Connecticut VMA, the New England VMA. I've done all of that, and you know, it's been very rewarding. I've had opportunities to lead and do different things. But I went to a board meeting of the Connecticut VMA, and I asked my colleagues, you know, have you guys been seeing rescue dogs in particular coming in for first visits that have had illnesses. Everybody has seen it. All the small animal veterinarians had seen it, and the horse veterinarians, they knew about it because often their family members had heard about it. So everybody, about 22 of us, all agreed that this was going on. And that's kind of what led to what I'm going to show you now. So, traditionally, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but there's all sorts of illegal activities in the world. You got gun running, you got moonshining, you got drug running. Now we got dog running. And here's a company, this is a driving company, and he calls his business DogRunnerPetTransport.com. And you may not be able to read it. I'm going to read you some lines from some of these, but not too many. He gets $125 per dog transported. Now, having heard these stories from my clients, and then going to my board meeting and hearing that my colleagues had been having this happen too, I really had to see it for myself. And I have one client who trains dogs and has connections to some of these rescue people. So she told me how to find out where the rendezvous point was. And so my hospital manager and I, we got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and we drove about 45 minutes and we parked in a Meineke, which is a muffler shop parking lot, next to this vacant commuter lot. It's about 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning, crisp January day. There's 2 empty cars parked in the lot, and we're just sitting there having hot coffee and trying to stay warm. 1 hour later, that's what we had in that parking lot. And now we're at a different perspective. You can see the Meineke in the background on the left upper, and then so now, once there was an adequate number of people, I just got out of the car and mixed with them. I wasn't wearing doctor clothes. I was just, jeans and a flannel shirt. And, I had a camera and I tried to be discreet. And you'll see that some of the photos are out of focus. But what you're looking at here is perhaps 70 people, maybe 58, somewhere in the 50 to 70 people. And there's 4 leaders or organizers. And you can see them, three of them anyway, off to the right. They got clipboards and one of them has a megaphone and they're telling the people how to behave when the transport finally arrives, off the highway that you can see in the background. And these are the people who are the leaders of individual rescue groups. On this trailer that's coming, the trailer driver, he's just a driver. He has nothing to do with the ownership of the animals. And in fact, he's registered with the US DOT, and you'll see that. But my point is that at least 4 different rescue organizations had animals coming off this trailer that was about to arrive. And sure enough, a little time later, they were late because of traffic. Up pulls this rig. And if you look closer, you'll see that it's a 2-ton pickup, an expensive diesel pickup with a 5th wheel pulling a 34-foot trailer. And it's packed with animals. There's at least 75 or 80 animals in there. They had dropped a few off in Hagerstown, Maryland, I was told. And you can see in the bottom right the inset. This is one rig for one company. It's among the best known, at least up in my part of the country. Peterson Express Transport Services Pets. It's owned by a gentleman named Kyle Peterson and his wife, and I will show you a few more slides relating to that. I mean, he's not a bad man. He's created a business for a market that exists with a product that has unlimited supply. And that's the part that I personally have a problem with. So once he pulled up, the people had already been instructed on how to behave, and they were to line up at the trailer. There's a card table you can't see behind the first part of the line where the rest of the money is paid. And it's all in cash. And I don't know whether the taxing authority is aware of this or not. I suspect that maybe not. And interestingly, some of the people in the line were off-duty police officers. They were there with their families to get their dog. So there's no shame or recognition that this whole process isn't right. And I'm going to show you why I think it isn't right as we go on. So the people paid their money and the animals started coming off. And the animals have been on the trailer more than 24 hours. They say they stop. Perhaps they do, but I don't know how you'd walk 75 animals at a truck stop somewhere. And so the animals come off this trailer. Now, mind you, you're all involved in breeding or you know people that are, and they come off the trailer into the hands of new owners, and 5 minutes later they're in a car going somewhere else. People have never seen the animals. They don't know them at all, and yet they're taking them home right then and there. How many of us would buy a 15-year commitment with 1 minute contact time? Just doesn't make any sense to me, but that's how this business is run, and it is a business. So I call this my field investigation 1. And just so you get an idea of it, I mean, I took as many pictures as I thought I could get away with without being, you know, beat up, because I wasn't really sure how this thing was going to go. And my hospital manager was with me, and I wouldn't mess with her, but we you know, we were outnumbered. And so I just give you these 2 images. You've got some puppies on the left. Now those puppies haven't been in shelter a long time. They're only, how old? 4 months, maybe 5 at most. And so you can't say that they were in a shelter for months taking up space. They must have just got wherever they started. And then on the right, you got a 12-year-old lab with a pot belly, thinning hair coat. My guess is he's increased thirst and urination, what we call PUPD, and he's probably got Cushing's disease coming on, or an abdominal mass, or some other reason for him to look like that. And so it just makes me wonder. I mean, we've got plenty of dogs that look like that right here in Connecticut. I say here, but and I did a little bit further, because the second part of my field investigation involved going to 3 shelters close by to the location of this parking lot. The Connecticut Humane Society, which is a well-funded brick-and-mortar shelter that has multiple locations in Connecticut. The Meriden Humane Society, which is a poorly funded, needing help humane organization, but in a brick-and-mortar facility. And then the Hartford Pound, which runs out of a private dog kennel training facility. And I'm just standing here to tell you that in those 3 places on that particular day, there was probably less than 3 out of 10 of the dogs were pit bulls, and the other 7 out of 10 were small dogs, medium dogs of various sizes and ages. It's, in my opinion, and this will contradict what I heard, it is a myth to say that, oh, they're all pit bulls, they're all schlabs, is that what you call them, Patty? That is something that they're saying, I believe, and I've become very jaded about this, because this is a business. It's a business, and there's no reason to stop it, because there's so much money flowing through it. And I'm going to show you how much money that I think is flowing through it and what the disposition of that money is. So these are nice individual dogs that deserve a humane life. But Connecticut already has plenty of dogs like that. And in my view, if the dog, for every dog that shows up in Connecticut, that is a dog that's already there that's not going to find a home that weekend. And when that happens, and again, now I'm in my own bias here on this, okay, so I admit that freely. But when that happens, when we talk about all this interstate movement in a positive way, we're basically saying, I'm not going to mention a state, but some other state in some other location in the country, they don't have to do their public education. They don't have to do appropriate funding of animal control. They can just do what they want, and you know, up in Connecticut, we're rich. We're gonna take care of it for you, and that's really what's been going on. And the deeper I got into this, the more it looked that way, not the less. So yeah, you know, it's sad that individual animals are being euthanized in shelters in the South, but individual animals are waiting for homes in Connecticut now. Why isn't those states where the animals are coming out of doing the hard work required for the 100,000 dogs that aren't born yet that are going to be in this pipeline 5 years from today? I'm not worried about the 20,000 that got transported this year. I want to know what's going to happen to the 20,000 in 2015 and the years after that. Now's the time to get busy in those states. And as I said, I'm not a big government guy, but there's no government in some places related to this. There's no funding for animal control. There's no public education. And I'm going to prove that to you right now. So this is a typical route. You can find all this stuff, the next few slides, you'll find it all on websites. This is Peterson's route. The drop-off points, the first one's in Hagerstown, Maryland, lower left. You notice they skipped Massachusetts. Massachusetts passed a law, the details of which prevent them from doing weekend random outdoor drop-off meetings. So what they do is they go up to Nashua, which is just over the Mass line in New Hampshire, and then the people from greater Boston that want to adopt a dog from this pathway, they'll get the dog from there and drive back. It doesn't take all that long. But as the New England states, you know, as each domino falls, and it is going to happen because all the states, all the state veterinarians, the state veterinary medical associations, we're all wise to this now. And we're all seeing the same thing. It's not just me and it's not just Connecticut. And so we're all going to try to put a little bit of a control on this thing so that our clients are protected from what you saw in that first couple of slides. So they keep a regular schedule. They do this every so often. This is one major method of dog trafficking that goes on. Now there's another method, and this method is called the adoption event. And it's practiced in a variety of different ways, but I've got some images from the website of the most egregious offender in Connecticut, the SPCA of Connecticut. Now doesn't that sound like a big organization? You know, you got the ASPCA, you got some other organizations. ASPCA, they do run, unlike HSUS, ASPCA runs a large shelter in New York City. You know, I'm not saying I like what they do, I don't, but they do at least run a shelter. This organization, I'm not even clear that they have a shelter. It's just sort of one man who's got a 501c3 of his own and he runs it out of his house. And the way this particular organization runs is once every 2 to 3 months he rents a Ryder truck, drives to Georgia, they empty a shelter, and they bring 75 to 100 dogs up at a high rate of speed overnight from this particular place in Georgia, and they bring them to an empty storefront next to a Petco in 3 or 4 locations in Connecticut. And it takes them 3 or 4 months, I guess, to fill that shelter back up in Georgia. And again, I've got 2 images at the bottom here that show puppies. You know, why are these puppies even being born in the states and the shelters from where they're coming? That's the question I'm asking. Instead of just pointing out how pitiful it is, somebody needs to go back to the source and act on that. And so, you know, I encourage people to think about that. If the animals that aren't going to get into homes and end up euthanized are never born, then that whole sad project goes away. Of course, the funding stream goes away too. So in this particular case, this rescue group based in Connecticut, Labs for Rescue, they have their own events utilizing delivery from the trailer, and the animals are often held in foster, and you know about that, and then they have this organization. So here is the SPCA Connecticut event that was held on that date in New Britain, Connecticut. It's an empty storefront. There's a Petco out of view to the left. And Petco loves this, and all the big chains that sell supplies do. Because after you get your dog, you've got to go get a bed and a bowl and some food and a leash and a collar, pooper scooper, and a toy or 2, you know, and on and on. So they have a financial motivation to abet this. And, you know, you can't say much about it. The dogs need homes. The citizens have empty houses. What's wrong with the problem? What's wrong with the situation? There's not much you can say about that. In this particular scene, you see that there's a man at the door holding a bunch of paperwork. To get into this thing, you had to fill out a form. And the form has all kinds of personal details on there. How many children? What ages? How many years have you been to education do you have? How much money do you make? Who's your doctor? What's wrong with you? You know, it goes on and on. They want to know everything there is to know about you, because they're trying to, in my opinion, is they're trying to make sure that nobody gets in there who's going to criticize what's going on or say anything. So you got to be going in there to adopt an animal. So, you know, we filled out the forms. This is a different day, but we did the same thing, filled out the forms, and went in there, took some photographs. Now, a lot of these are out of focus. I definitely didn't want to be caught photographing in here. This is an empty storefront. There's Petco signs everywhere. There's some booths from vendors, just like we have in this room. Different small vendors of different kinds. An invisible fence company was one. A private pet store was another. And these animals are, they're dogs. You can look, if you look closely on the bottom right, you see that the cage panels are cable tied together. It's a real quick assembly on this process. And there's pine shavings on the floor and people just walk around and view the animals, and then they make a decision that's going to last 15 years, and out they go. And I just have a couple images of this. They're a little bit redundant, but it shows you, you know, people lined up. There is a interview process. I mean, let's face it, the organizers of this organization and this event, they don't want the animals back, because if they give the animals back, the people, then you have to give some of the money back. Now, you'd think that there is a pet lemon law in Connecticut which says that if a pet store or a breeder sells an animal, people have 30 days to return it, and those people have to give their money back. In this particular operation, up till the passage of the law that we created, These people didn't have to do anything. The animal could be sick, and other than whatever it said in the contract, they didn't have to do anything for those people. And that's how come people ended up. Now, this man, Fred Acker, this is the man I told you about. He's the head of this organization. And interestingly, the brick and mortar shelters and the Connecticut-based rescues that do not import detest and abhor this man because he outcompetes them for homes for the animals, because he has these events and he turns over 75 to 100 animals on a Saturday and a Sunday. And that's 100 homes that don't get Connecticut source animals. So is that fair to those animals? I mean, fairness really isn't part of this thing, but that's the question I ask. I mean, meanwhile, the creation of the animals runs unabated at the source. It just makes me crazy to think about that. And I can't think of a single reason why that's happening, why no one cares about stopping this, that all the efforts are focused on remediation, on taking animals that have no homes that would be euthanized and getting it into homes. There is very little thought as to stopping the what I call unintended spontaneous reproduction in the first place. Now, I had to come up with that term, cumbersome term, because I can't use breeding, because the word breeding has been poisoned now. I was thinking about this last night. I wish people who breed purebred dogs would come up with a different term for themselves, because the word breeding is detested in the media and by all these organizations. There ought to be a new word that just gets away from all that. I see people squirming over here. I'm not being insulting anybody. I'm saying, you understand what I'm saying is, we talked a lot about the PR, but the reason is right there in front of us. This is all about money, and the fact is, the higher the euthanasia numbers in those southern shelters, whether it's real or imagined, whether it's true or a lie, the higher the numbers, the better the PR, and the more the transports get to do. It's as simple as that. Sorry, sir?
Did you take that picture?
No. That's from a drug bust. But it makes the point, does it not? I'm honest about the fact that this is anecdotal, but some of it to me is common sense. I tell the researchers here, prove me wrong that the solution to too many euthanasias is not stopping the births. Nobody wants to try that. It's too hard. It's too hard. The culture is wrong. I'll wait till I show you the next couple of slides. I couldn't believe some of the things I've read on the websites of the rescue groups, and they think it's a positive thing, so it couldn't be a lie. It has to be true. Now, this is an aside. Emotionally manipulative terminology. How many words can we think of in the political animal world that have been commandeered by groups that have agendas? Factory farming, puppy mill, horse slaughter, rescue, adopt, right. What's that, sir? Shelter, right. Even the word shelter, it's not quite what it means. And to me, these images are images of rescue, but that's not really what we're talking about today. So I know you can't see this. I'm just going to read some of the underlined sentences to get you thinking about it the way I've been thinking about it. Top right, many adopters choose to adopt a dog sight unseen. How many of you who breed think that's a good idea? I mean, that's an internet sale. I've heard several people say that's a bad idea. Then left side, we rescue dogs from southern shelters and house them in foster homes in the South until they're ready to come to an adoptive home. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, except why is that necessary? Why is that necessary at all? And then another sentence, again, redundant. Many times, adoptions are long distance, and a dog goes directly from our southern foster homes to a northern home. I wonder what percentage of those end up in a northern shelter 6 weeks later when there's a behavior problem or bites a kid or something that can't be anticipated from the false image on the petfinder.com website in the first place. Our southern adoptions are long distance and the dogs are taken directly home from the transport. No, that's a bad idea. I don't think that's a good idea. Expert marketing throughout this thing. Someone else mentioned it in one of their lectures. I don't recall who it was. A couple of sentences I had to pull out of here. These are all from rescue group and transport company websites. They're proud of the things that I criticize them for. It is sad that we must send our homeless dogs hundreds of miles into other states. Why not focus on stopping the birth of these homeless dogs in other states? And I hate to be pejorative against Southerners. I lived in Gainesville, Florida for 7 years. I listen to country music, and I am not an arrogant New York liberal, okay? But it says it right on the website. Southerners have excellent taste in dogs. They just don't spay and neuter or keep them on their property. I mean, is this a hard thing to understand? Why there's, if they're not neutered and the female's in heat, haven't you ever been to a bar at night? I mean, it's just the same thing, And then they're so honest. And here's a great one. I've underlined it so I could find it during this talk. Enterprising souls on both sides are making this market work. On the rescue website, they're admitting it's a business. There's no mystery to that. There's money in it. There's an overpopulation of dogs in the South. Unfortunately, many owners do not spay or neuter their pets, which encourages this epidemic. Well, then that's where the solution must be, because that's where the problem is. Any state that's overproducing, and I'm not talking about purebreds, I'm not talking about what you guys do. I'm talking about this whole mixed breed, non-denominational rescue process. I just am amazed. The further I learn, the more I learn about it, the more amazed I am. Maybe you know this. The dogs run adoption fees. They call them adoption fees and not sale price to avoid the taxation that inevitably comes when your 501c3 is pulled because somebody drops a dime on you. $450 to $575. 75 dogs in the trailer, $575. Let's say 500, nice round number. Do the math. In one trip, over 17, 18 hours of driving, you can make, what, $10,000, $12,000 easy. Easy. Okay, and the prices vary. So these are the adoption costs right off the web, and their contracts are real interesting too. Here's one from real local by me in Connecticut. The contract specifies $100 refund if you return the dog. So even if you don't, and then they get to adopt it out again. In fact, I could conceive of an organization just owning one dog with such bad behavior that he just keeps coming back. I mean, it would be a perfect job for a retired person because you just drive and pick him up and then drop him off again. Probably make $200 a day that way. Supplement Social Security, which is going away anyway. But so Connecticut, this is what everybody has, and that can't be right. It can't be right that they've also got other disclaimers on their issues. If there's any medical issues identified, you got 1 week. After that, you're on your own. And a veterinarian has to identify the medical issue. You can't just say there's one. So that's another organization, Sunshine Goldens, that's part of their contract. Now, foster care, that's how they use to warehouse their product. By having caring, altruistic families take in a foster dog and have it live with them and their own pets, they avoid all the licensing and inspection and hard costs of utilities and all of that stuff that is normal part of having a brick and mortar facility, whether it's a shelter or whatever you're going to call it. And they do that fostering at a distance as well as within the state, and that was completely uncontrolled. Who knows how many dogs are in foster just in Connecticut right now? It's got to be 1,000. It's just got to be. If they're bringing in the numbers that they're bringing in. Here's something great. I found this by accident. Sub-fostering. Anybody ever heard that word? Sub-fostering, if you read the fine print, what it says is that you could just foster for like 2 weeks. So if you have, say, 100 families who are willing to watch a dog for 2 weeks, nobody has any responsibility at all. You just got the product out there and it just keeps moving around before the rug gets damaged. And so that's what it's all about, is keeping the product on hand so that when a willing family comes, there's no waiting, because it's an impulse purchase. It's like going through the grocery store line and there's some nuts there, some candy that your kid wants, and it's brightly lit up, this is all, a lot of it's impulse purchase on a different level. Now here's another slide from Peterson. This is right off their website, and I put it in because I just couldn't resist. As we became more involved, our volunteer work developed into a full-time job. I mean, they're honest about the business of this, and there's a lot of money in it. You've seen some of those numbers already. The transport itself is not as lucrative, but it's pretty lucrative, and the commitment is so much less. You've only got responsibility of the animals for the 24 or 36 hours it takes to pick them up and move them to wherever they're going in this situation. And if you do the math on this, if there's 75 dogs on a transport and they get 100 to 200 bucks, that's anywhere from $7,500 to $15,000 gross profit on just for one day, just for that one day. And if you run, as Peterson does, 3-4 different rigs over the course of the different routes over the course of a weekend, that's some serious money. 50, 52 weeks a year, it's a lot of money. And you know, you got to think about that. Money corrupts, right? So, and then here's one that's near and dear to my heart. I fly a small airplane. I flew down here for this weekend, and I love to fly, and all pilots who fly love to fly. And there's at least 3 pilot organizations that have kind of cropped up to move these animals, and they don't charge, or they're not supposed to, for the movement of the animals. So they're spending, on the right you see the gentleman with the cowboy hat, that's a twin Bonanza. He's spending $200 a flight hour to move those dogs, and it's not costing the rescue group anything. I don't even think they can compensate him for his fuel. Just as an aside, the federal aviation regulations prohibit a private pilot, a pilot with the initial certificate, from flying for compensation or hire if in the course, whatever the business is. If you were flying to a conference, that's one thing. Somebody could recompensate you for your expenses. But if you're moving a product or passengers, and that's the business itself, then you can't do that. That's considered a commercial operation, like an airline. And in order to do that, the operation has to have a license, a flying license. So not just the pilot, but the operation. So when we go fly on American Airlines, let's say, or United, the pilots all have certificates, and the airline has their own certificate. And that's how the FAA makes sure that the planes are safe and the mechanics are safe. So this whole thing is probably illegal under the FARs, but nobody's looking into it and nobody's talking about it. And irony, like dogs, is not in short supply. And as you can see, having each and every animal we transport spayed and neutered is very important to us. We don't want to create an overpopulation problem we have down here in the south in the north. So we're going to ship it out of state. That's what they're doing. You know, the fact that there is a relative shortage of dogs in the north, is rescue dogs, it's shelter dogs in the north, is not a reason to fill that need with more shelter dogs. The reason that was created is because we have shelters, public education, animal control laws, and animal control officers. If all of that was going on in the source states, maybe there wouldn't be this whole process. I see it as an enablement of irresponsibility, state to state. And in the bottom one, these are funny, that's the only reason I've included them. Spay-neuter laws are not strict. Oh, this is the first sentence where the arrow is on the left. You can't see it, but I'm going to read it. Spay-neuter laws are not strictly enforced, and many residents believe a dog loses his or her instinct and aptitude for hunting when they are sterilized. So they're just admitting that we're not responsible in these states, and we're not going to be responsible. Some Southerners have to supplement their incomes by breeding and selling dogs. These, quote, breeders essentially operate small-scale puppy mills and refuse to acknowledge that the demand for their product is very low. I've heard, on authority that I respect, that some of the puppies that come off these transports, they're sold into that at 25 bucks a head. Because 25 from 475 still leaves 450 minus 100 or 200 for the travel. There's plenty of profit there regardless. And if that's what we're enabling, that's just wrong. It's just wrong. And finally, on these type of slides, national animal non-governmental organizations enable this process. They're connected to it in a variety of ways. They bless it. They give them awards. You can see that little certificate says American Humane Association Best Practice Award 2006 for transport. They're not two separate things. This rescue process and the income it produces, there is trickle-down income to the national NGOs, and that money goes to pay lobbyists who make your poultry and eggs more expensive. It's as simple as that. Dog rescue is used as a funding mechanism for animal rights campaigns. That's a controversial statement of the day. I will say it, and I stand by it. Now, having said that, you know, all my own philosophy aside, everybody on the CVMA board doesn't agree with some of the stuff I just said to you here today, but they all understood that their clients deserved that animals they were getting, if they were going to be sick, they should know about it in advance, and if they were willing to take a sick animal, that's their business, but they shouldn't be defrauded like that. And so we went forward with support. Now, the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, they've been trying to get control of this issue for 4 years. And Connecticut's legislature is it's two houses but one party. You may know about that. And it's just a very difficult situation. Even the Department of Agriculture is pretty weak, and animal health issues were often ignored when it came from the Department of Ag. So we teamed up with them because we cared about this. As we became knowledgeable about it, we really felt we didn't have a choice. And we had quiet support from the Connecticut Dog Federation. I don't know if there's anybody here from Connecticut, but Connecticut Dog Federation is like any other dog federation. There's Pennsylvania Federation, I think, is here. And they are a club of clubs and a nice group of people. But when I talked to them about their support, because they came to me and asked, I said that they had to do it quietly. And you know why? Because we didn't want to be able to be accused that the breeders were behind it. And you know how that would go politically. It was us in the Department of Ag. It was all about animal health. That was the bottom line. So we had a legislator who's sympathetic from Agricultural Region of the state, Brian Hurlburt, and he agreed. He listened to us, and he agreed to put a bill into the committee. It's the Environment Committee in Connecticut that handles things agriculture. And almost accidentally, the way Connecticut works, you're going to change the law, you just look at existing law and you propose new language in the same existing legislation. So we took the pet shop requirements and we added a paragraph for rescue, adoption, transfer, import, all that. We threw it in there. And so the proposed working draft came out with this title. You can't see it. It says, "An act extending certain pet shop licensee requirements to persons and organizations that import animals for adoption." Well, that was an accidental masterstroke, because the organizations that import animals for adoption, they went wild. It was as if we called their mother a dirty name, because the very idea that regulations that would control them would be in the same section of the law as pet shops. I mean, they got so mad. They literally got so mad that they lost their focus, and they lost valuable time, valuable lobbying time that probably didn't help them get all they wanted out of this. And I'll get into who they was. So we didn't just let it lie there with proposing a bill. We lobbied ourselves. Members of the board, the CVMA board, made phone calls to their local state legislators. I published an editorial in the Hartford Courant, which you see on the left, that was all positive. A lot of the criticism, if any of you read any of the NAIA blog about it or any of the stuff that was on there, was, well, why aren't you looking into pet stores and why aren't you looking into puppy mills? I mean, I was polite, but because it's about you, that's why. And so this article is positive. If anybody wants a copy, you can email me and I'll send it to you. We also had a focus on our internal public relations, because remember, veterinarians are a general population just like any other. And on the right is a bulletin article in the Connecticut VMA quarterly newsletter from Executive Director Simon Flynn, which makes many of the same points that I made in my editorial. So we had 5 strategies to get control of this issue that was harming our clients and the animals they already owned. First of all, first one was to advocate animal health. Well, I'm not going to read all these points to you, but you saw already, the animals are arriving with undeclared diseases. They're exposing other animals, novel disease, and transport animals themselves were getting sick on the trailers. And I didn't mention it before, but the guy who has those events, when a dog is sick in that storefront, what he does is he runs it around the back and puts it back in the truck for the rest of the weekend. And it stays in there. And when I did my investigation, my manager and I, we went around the back and we banged on the truck and barking began. So dogs are sitting in a truck for 48 hours because they can't be sold at that moment. You know, that's not right either. Second strategy was to promote humaneness. You know, animals being surrendered because the people couldn't afford the unanticipated care. Behavioral issues, you would know. And my favorite, that Connecticut origin animals are being passed over. You know, yeah, the pit bulls are going to be passed over, but what about the 7 out of 10 that weren't pit bulls, that didn't find homes? And, you know, the public gets misled, and as we've heard from multiple speakers and multiple audience members, that has consequences that reach far beyond this particular issue. And the public also doesn't know that we're enabling irresponsibility elsewhere when we allow this in an uncontrolled fashion. The consumer protection angle. Unexpected costs of care, I mentioned already. Connecticut has a pet lemon law that applied to pet stores and breeders, but it's brick and mortar locations, somebody you can find. Some of these organizations, you can't find them when you got your dog already. And so, you know, they're skirting all the laws. That was the other part. Because different legislators respond to different arguments. So when you have talking points, you got to make sure you think about what the interests are of all sorts of different people. Some of them are consumer protection oriented. Some of them are animal rights oriented, et cetera, et cetera. Minimizing cost. I mean, we're in a fiscal crisis nationally. Connecticut's particularly hard hit. You know, if I won't offend anybody, it's a state that's run by its public sector unions. There is a lot of problems in our budget, and the longer animals wait in municipal shelters, the more animal control costs are. Paying people to come in after hours to walk and care for animals. We're shifting costs from other states. And then organizations in our state lose opportunities to place animals and lose opportunities to get donations to do ongoing animal care. That's a big negative. And finally, the summary talking points. Disease, medical issues that are surprising adopters, new surrenders that were occurring after adoption, after importation. It's the same things I mentioned. I won't read it all to you, but these are the basic talking points. This is what we used to convince, not to end importation, but to control it. And to control it in a way that would be slowed down some. And that's ultimately what we got. Now, there was opposition to this. There is a nonprofit organization. It's a C6. It's made up of leaders of other, it's an organization of organizations. It's like the Federation of Animal Welfare Groups in Connecticut. It's really a PAC. It's headed by local and national activist group leaders. It's enabled by at least 1 and sometimes 2 state legislators who are animal activists. And as you know, what many of the organizations do is they conflate animal rights activism with homeless pet advocacy. Those two things are not the same. One has to do with individual animals that sadly don't have homes and might get euthanized, and the other has to do with animal supremacist points of view, such as chickens in cages and gestation crates and horse slaughter and all sorts of things that really have nothing to do with pets, but that the funding from one helps promote the other. On this slide, I just emphasize that the president of Connecticut Votes for Animals is a woman named Deborah Bresch. She's a paid ASPCA employee with a Connecticut residence. And then the other woman, Susan Linker, runs a sanctuary, so-called. It's an animal shelter. They have property but no buildings. So I don't quite know how they run it. I think it's really just a foster network. But that's what this is about. And they were built up around the idea that they're going to look like a coalition, and they're going to be able to support a particular legislator named Diana Urban. Diana Urban is an accomplished equestrian in college, and she's now an animal rights advocate, and she's a legislator in the state of Connecticut who's been around for a while. The middle photo on the top shows her giving a check to the ASPCA for animal victims of Hurricane Katrina with other members of other organizations, including Connecticut Votes for Animals. And the other photos, which you can't see at all, are just an animal rights day at the legislature that Connecticut Votes for Animals had. So this trio is the main operators for extreme positions in Connecticut with respect to animal management. Now, in return, we have this other fellow, Brian Hurlbert, who is also a legislator in Connecticut, same party as Representative Urban, which is good, so that there's not a natural animosity between them. And he's from an agricultural area, was involved in 4-H as a kid, and that photograph shows him with a 4-H club. So we know when we have someone who's involved in 4-H that they're probably on our side on these kind of battles. And so he introduced the bill that I showed you earlier into committee, and you can't see it at all, but the right is the tally. 27-0, it was voted out of committee, including the support of Representative Urban. What could they really say? We made animal health the lever, the fulcrum point of this whole thing. Even the people who were promoting rescue and importation because it's humane for the individual animal really couldn't get around the fact that the entire Veterinary Medical Association was saying that a significant proportion of imported animals are arriving sick and defrauding the public of money, and heartbreak, not to mention. So when it got to the full legislature, we were almost unanimous. 143-2 in the House, 36-0 in the Senate. The animal health argument prevailed. So there's a lesson there. If you get a veterinary medical organization behind you on an issue that's clean and pure in terms of its various fingers, you know, it's hard to beat this thing. It's hard to beat. And so we ended up with Public Act 11-187 that sat there a while, right to the end of the session. We never knew if the governor would sign it until the moment he did. It was like 5 minutes to 12 on the last night. The Connecticut Votes for Animals organization put on a furious telephone calling campaign. And when we heard about it, we had to do the same. So at that point, we unleashed the Connecticut Dog Federation and all their constituent clubs and the Connecticut Veterinary Medical Association. We got, you know, some of our members are politically active, so maybe 60 of us were calling. And I contacted Patty Strand, who had NAIA members. Thank you if any of you were among them who made calls. We buried them in phone calls, and the governor ended up signing it. And he worried about the fallout on this because he didn't want to be perceived as, you know, not being helpful to animals. So what does 11-187 do? It provides for the registration of all groups that import animals into Connecticut from other states. Name, address, phone number, and the address is the very important part because some of the groups were just rescue groups from other states. There's one in Nashville called Big Fluffy Dog Rescue. The executive of that group is an attorney who does this thing on the side as a hobby, and she you know, I watch over my shoulder for her because she's gunning for me in one way or another. But the point is, there needs to be a Connecticut address for service of process. We made this part of it's about consumer protection. You know, the legislators understood that if there's no address, there's no way to reach out to these people if an animal's sick and there's no recourse. There's a fee for registration. It's a modest $100. The groups have to agree to keep records of the numbers and all the certificates and paperwork on each and every animal. They have to record the origins of the animals and the type of animals they are, cat, dog. They're importing cats on some of these trailers. Is there a state that doesn't have a surplus of cats? I saw that with my own eyes. I couldn't believe it. Cats coming off the trailers. Anyway, there's a fine for noncompliance of $500, and one thing that we were able to give on was this exemption for volunteers. If you're a foster home person, you don't have to register as long as you're connected to a rescue group that is. Now, you know, everybody's thinking out there, how are you going to police this thing? You know, it's great to have a law. How are you going to police it? Well, I'm coming to that. The other great thing that happened with this was in the law, the words transfer, rescue, adoption were defined. Those words were never in there before. Now they have definitions. So if we have to go back to fix something about this thing, you know, transfer is a transfer. An animal is brought in from another state and you give it to somebody else. Now you might be thinking, well, how does that affect breeders, you know, in-state breeders who move animals back and forth? It really doesn't. because if you're taking an animal to yourself as an owner, that's your animal. It's not relevant. If you are borrowing a stud, it's not your animal. It's not relevant. And if you are importing a dog to transfer to someone else, that animal belongs to someone else. They've already paid you. It's not the same. It's not relevant. This is all about shelter animals, and it's defined enough that the PJAC, which is the lobby for pet stores in Connecticut, they sort of went through this, and they were satisfied with it, and we had support from Connecticut Dog Federation, so nobody found anything in it that was going to hamper their legal activities. Another aspect of this is 10 days before you want to have an event, like a drop-off in a parking lot or a pet store, a vacant storefront event, you got to notify the Department of Ag 10 business days before. And you have to notify the zoning enforcement official of the community in which this thing is going to be held. Connecticut's a home rule state. We've got 169 towns and 2 Indian nations. And every one of them rules their own territory with an iron fist. And so zoning officials, the answer is no, unless you can convince them otherwise. And so that's going to slow down some of this Wild West show that we had going on here. Pet shops are excluded. The animals can be inspected at any time by state animal control officers. However, warrantless searches are prohibited. Now, that was a big deal to these rescue people. They had it in their minds that the Department of Ag was going to burst into foster homes, with black paint and smoke grenades, and they were going to check out those animals at any time. Well, I mean, this is America. You have to have a warrant to search somebody's house. But the Department of Ag can get a warrant. They were all bent out of shape about it. I mean, they don't even have personnel to do regular inspections. How the heck are they going to? But that was what they're worried about. So we gave on it because it didn't cost us anything. Finally, the USDA health certificate that's required for interstate transport is still required, but it was re-emphasized. And again, the words adoption and transfer were re-emphasized later in the law. And here's the biggest thing, and this is what I was personally accused of greed and some other things. The dogs have to be examined by a Connecticut licensed veterinarian 10 days after arrival and every 90 days thereafter until it goes to its final disposition. And so you can see that, it would be perceived that we were in this to make money and that it was all about us. But the point was that USDA accredited veterinarians who can sign interstate health certificates, which I am also, there's people who are just signing a bunch of health certificates and letting somebody else fill out the information. And that's what's been going on. And perhaps in certain states, there's a USDA veterinarian that works closely, accredited veterinarian who works closely with a group, and they just sign whatever. If the animal looks healthy, it's healthy. But what about after it comes through the stress of transport and arrives in Connecticut? So that kind of closes the front door on this whole thing, that you can't sneak an animal in and expect that it's going to be unhealthy and you're going to get away with it. That's not going to happen. And so the Department of Ag created a registration form, both for groups to register as they're supposed to and if they're going to hold an event. And so now we have this formal process, replaces the Wild West show, I like that phrase. And the beautiful thing is, if some of you are thinking, well, and somebody said this to me the other night, or I read it somewhere. I can't remember where I heard. We were talking about it last night, I think. It can't be enforced. There's not enough personnel. It's true. Department of Ag has not enough personnel to police this thing properly. Absolutely not, and they never will. So how is this law going to change anything? The groups are going to go underground. This is what Connecticut Votes for Animals said. The groups are going to go underground. They'll do what they want anyway, and it's not going to change anything. The legitimate groups, the ones that want to comply and be able to be out in the open, they're not going to like having the competition from the illegal groups. And they'll be dropping a dime on all of those groups. Or maybe it's a quarter today. So there is a self-policing element to this. We were never trying to stop import. Whatever I think about what's going on, that's besides the point. The legislation's focus was to make sure that healthy animals came to willing Connecticut consumers. And then finally, while CVA and the ASPCA didn't get all we had hoped for, we did negotiate the best possible bill over the course of the session. And it says on the last arrow that they tried to avoid having small importers affected by this, and we fought violently to keep them in, because as you saw in the parking lot, it's the small importers doing the biggest damage. Fred Acker may be a jerk, and the way his organization runs is unethical and inhumane, but if he's bringing in 75 dogs every 3 months or 100, that's less than these trailers, of which there's 4 routes in Connecticut that are bringing in 400 every weekend. Do the math. It's just the bigger problem is the small importers. So this is back to my opinion, but pet surplus, however you want to look at it, it's a national problem, a nationwide problem, but not really a national issue. It's not going to be solved with federal legislation. It's going to be solved at the state level, one state at a time, because of federalism. Mr. Prager, am I wrong about that? Animal control is a state purview, and it's got to be solved one state at a time. It's the only way.